Will City. Self-care Sunday. Yo. I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that a self-care Sundays and dreams come true. They really do.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of Season 2 of Self-Care Sundays. We are talking to Cato Zane today. If you're a regular listener of Self-Care Sundays, that name probably sounds familiar because Cato is our very own audio engineer. Before we get started with Cato, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon as we close out Season 2. Patreon allows supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, such as monthly maintenance fees. If you'd like to help us out, please check out patreon.com/selfcaresundays-podcast. That's patreon.com/selfcaresundays-podcast. Thank you in advance. It is the generosity of our listeners that helps this information be accessible to so many people in the first place. Let's get started. How are you today, Cato?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. So, as you know, we like to start the episode by asking our guests to talk us through a typical day and where self-care plays a role in their day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for me, doing audio, I do a lot of freelance stuff. I used to do more stuff in studios, but lately I've been moving more towards working from home. And part of that's because I built up a studio at home, and then clients tend to prefer not to pay the extra for the studio fee sometimes. So I've been working at home more lately. So for me, self-care tends to be a lot of the typical work from home stuff, freelancer stuff. So it'll be things like making sure I leave the house or go for a walk or actually shower, or not be in my PJs all day. So I guess that's pretty much it. I've gotten better at doing more food prep stuff in my house. Like I'll take a 5-minute break. Oh, the other thing is doing audio. It's really important to take breaks because your ears adjust as you listen to something over time. So I've gotten much better at taking breaks and just, doing a quick clean something in the house or do a quick food prep thing. So I've been doing that more.
So how did you kind of figure out that these habits were important for you or that these were things that you really needed to make sure you were doing?
Well, I get chronic migraines, so I've had phases where those have been really bad. I had one summer where I had a migraine that basically lasted the whole summer. That was pretty rough. And I went to a neurologist and all sorts of doctors, and they all said everything was fine. You probably just have migraines, which is another word for them not really knowing why you get these really bad headaches. So, I just kind of learned over time that if I give myself those breaks, that kind of stuff is better. So that's kind of forced me into it. The other part of it is I was going pretty hard for a while in college, and then right after college, I went from being a single major to a triple major our junior year. And so I didn't have a lot of free time. So I was doing I had no life junior and senior year. And then afterwards, I started working in theater and doing some studio work and doing freelance work. And so all that added up, and it was I had no free time and I wasn't giving myself breaks. And I was, I would work all day and then I'd go home and maybe sit in front of the TV and watch something, but I'd be working while I was watching something, doing the more administrative stuff or whatever needed to be done, working on my website, stuff like that. So I've kind of learned since then that started to wear me out too hard and I was getting headaches too often. And so I've kind of relaxed in the years since then.
Was there some big burnout point, or was it a gradual realization over time that this isn't working for me?
It was kind of more, I guess it was more gradual. I remember at one point my husband said to me, he was like, it's okay to be in more of an absorption phase than a creation phase, because there was some point when I was just sitting chilling and I was like, oh, this feels weird not to be doing some sort of constructive work thing. And I'd have a lot of anxiety around just chilling out and not working. And so he would say things like that. Well, maybe this is just, something you need to do as a part of your absorption phase. And so I think about that a lot, actually, which is kind of weird. But
no, I think it's an interesting thing because it makes something that maybe feels passive seem productive in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And it's I can kind of, it's totally rationalization. It's not, I don't know how legit this is, but it's I can be watching a movie and be like, well, this is me researching for when I do sound design for a film, so I don't know. I've learned to kind of make that kind of an excuse for myself. So I slow down.
Yeah. I think that it's like whatever kind of mental trick like allows you to do what you need to do to feel like okay, right? So it's like whatever works, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so you mentioned like the chronic migraines. As you know, like I have epilepsy. So for me, I feel like chronic illness is like an interesting thing because it really forces you to take care of yourself in a way, because like the way I phrased it is like I get bitch slapped if I don't. Like my body will like bitch slap me and be like, what are you doing? Like you need to like, this is not okay. And so it's like of course like a curse in the sense that it's like so forced, but I feel like it's also a gift because you don't just keep going. Like you kind of have a reminder to stop.
Yeah, and I mean, now I've slowed down enough to where it's like I make fun of my husband for being a workaholic. So, but yeah, the migraines. And then I also have this thing called, it's POTS. So it's called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So it's like basically my blood vessels don't adjust to things. So when I go from sitting to standing, my heart rate can go from like 60 beats per minute to like 120 or more. And so sometimes your heart can kind of go into shock from that. This is my totally not medical understanding.
Yeah.
So your heart can kind of go into shock from that and then you faint, right? So I first fainted in like 3rd grade was the first time. So that's been another part of it, I guess. But it's definitely forced me to kind of slow down and make sure
just
I drink
like
more
pay
water.
more attention, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Stuff like that.
You were saying drinking more water and...
Yeah. So one of the things they tell you when they finally figure out that you have POTS is to make sure you drink more water and actually eat more salt. So I got better at doing that once we found out what it was. They actually thought I had epilepsy at first. So there was like a period where they put me on epilepsy meds. And
didn't help?
Nope, didn't help.
Yeah. But it is interesting because it kind of forces you to pay more attention to your body in a way that like not everyone is forced to do. And it's interesting for me watching my parents as they're getting older and my dad's like, oh, there's this. And I'm like, I've been paying attention to kind of like what my body needs and how it like adjusts in different kind of scenarios forever.
To your parents, are your parents as into that as you are? Because I've noticed with my parents, like they're not self-care people at all. So I had to kind of learn it.
No, they're not. But like, I think like now that they're getting a little bit older, it's forcing them to be, and they find it very like uncomfortable, and they find it very burdensome that like, oh, my dad's like, oh man, I have to pay attention to my health now. Like it's like, he's like very frustrated by it. I'm like, you got to wait till you were almost 60 to do that. I've been doing that forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you think about like how your identity informs your self-care habits? I know that like women make up an insanely small portion of audio engineers, and I wonder if like some of the drive or the motivation to go so hard, especially early in your career, was due to that.
Right. Yeah. So from the numbers that I've seen, it's audio engineers. If I'm remembering right, it's like 2%, which is actually less than the Marines. So they have a higher percentage of women. And it wasn't weird for me at first because I don't have any sisters. I have brothers. I'm kind of used to being outnumbered. But I have had scenarios where, I don't know, it's kind of like the Wild West with audio. You know, there's a lot of the rules don't apply. A lot of studios will ask you to do work that's, you know, off the books or like they're not paying you for, and they'll ask you to do that in exchange for, you know, time in the being allowed even to work in the studio. So things like that have come up. I feel like sometimes studios will push you a little bit more as a woman, and you kind of, you know, for your own sanity, have to tell them no or, you know, be honest with them about it. But I don't know, identity. I mean, I'm pretty boring white bread, you know, I'm like a white girl married to a straight guy from most of I grew up in Connecticut.
It sounds like from your experience that like setting boundaries as a woman in audio was just like really important for you.
Yeah. And I had a big point in time where I was at this one studio in San Diego and they were doing a lot of stuff like that. And I remember there's this guy that came into the studio and he had no studio experience. He was like a DJ, he'd made some beats and stuff, but he had never worked in a studio before. He himself said that he didn't know what a lot of the gear was and what a lot of the stuff was. And there was this job that opened up in the studio that was like more administrative. It was like a full-time job, which is really rare with a lot of studios. So I went for the job, and the job, part of it involved like giving tours to potential clients and to, you know, kids and their families for the summer camp program that they had there. And the owner gave this guy the job. So there are two owners. One of the owners gave this guy the job, and I guess they knew him socially, was my understanding. So I went to the owners and I have this all in writing, like in emails and stuff. But I asked them like what the reason was, because I couldn't figure out like why this guy would get the job over me. You know, I had like years of experience and I'd been there longer and, you know, the whole deal. And I've been doing work for them for free on the side too. And so it like stresses me out to think about this. So anyway, so the owners replied to me like in the email and they said, there's no reason for it. And I was like, so I'm the one female in this place, and you're telling me that you just hired this guy who has less experience from me, and you can't give me a single reason for it. I was like, wow, that's just kind of a lawsuit waiting to happen. But I mean, so yeah. I complained about that because I like to take the approach of just if I have an issue with somebody, I'll just tell them, you know? So I said something, and then they tried to retroactively charge me for classes that I had sat in on. And I had like in writing an email with them about how, we'll let you sit in and audit these classes in exchange for all the work you've done for us. So I was like, that, you know, I'm not going to agree to that. I'm not going to pay for these after the fact. I wouldn't have done them if I had to pay for them, you know? So then we kind of like basically broke up with the studio. I stopped going there. But just a lot of little things like that adding up over time. And a lot of studios are really cool. Like they're not all like that, but it took me a really long time to realize it's just not worth the stress of being treated that way. So I don't know.
Yeah. And your story is like not an atypical one whenever they talk about, whenever you like all the studies of like women, you know, with sexual harassment, pay equity, whatever, like retaliation is just very common when people try to raise these issues. It's just, it's such a common thing that like people get mad and they try to like basically, I mean, because it ends up being a power play, right? That they're just trying to show you that they're actually in charge.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually with this guy, like after he got the job, he came up to me at one point and he was like making jokes about crack. And I was like, I don't think that's funny. And meanwhile, he's like slacking off and getting paid while I was doing some free work for them on the side. And so like he comes up to me while I'm sitting at this desk doing this work for free. He's getting paid for this job that I wanted to get. He starts making crack jokes. And I was like, that's not funny. I don't think crack jokes are funny. And then he started making fun of me and he's like, oh, what's wrong? You know, like, you know, you take too many cold meds today or whatever. I'm like, no, I just don't think it's funny. And then he's like, oh, what's wrong? Are you on your period? And I was just like, well, that's it. So I complained.
Well, there that is.
Yeah, I was like, bye. Like, I don't know what to tell you. So I actually complained in writing that time to the owners too, and they didn't do anything. So I don't know. I don't know how that applies to self-care, but you know, I eventually left the place. So I guess that
sounds like self-care to me.
Yeah.
that it's like kind of figuring out. And I think it's challenging anytime you're like, I don't think it's industry specific, but I think it's just like always challenging to figure out your boundaries. But then particularly when you're in these contexts where you're like not sure if the other options are better options because like that makes it challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Because if you were like really sure that I could go to this other place and it would be like so much better, then like that's different than being like, I don't know. They might all be this way.
Yeah, exactly. And part of what like gave me the guts to tell them off and leave was that I had affiliations with other studios in the area. So yeah, someone who didn't have that would be stuck, I guess. Yeah.
And I think also like just earlier in your career when you're just not sure what to expect of places, where you're like, I don't know if this is just like how workplaces are and if this is normal or if this is a problem. It's hard to calibrate.
Right. Yeah. And and I've heard that studios in LA are a lot more legit about how they operate, you know, but yeah, there's a lot of wondering what's to be expected and what you should stand up against, I guess.
But you do a lot of work kind of like working with inner city students with Music for Peace San Diego and in collaboration with Playing for Change in the UN. So you must be kind of yourself getting out there and kind of, I don't know if creating transparency is the right idea, but like making it so that there is less wondering for others.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And like the stuff with the kids, it's all from meeting this one woman who I met through a different studio. I was assisting this guy in a studio in town, and that's how I met them. I went out and I made a lot of connections in different parts of town, and that's helped a lot. But that can be really hard and take a long time, and it did take me a long time. Yeah.
Do you feel like doing that kind of work outside, whether it's like with students or with other initiatives, do you feel like, does that become a form of self-care for you, or does that also become like a suck on your energy? Like how does that fit into your work life kind of balance?
Well, like to some extent it depends on the day, right? Because you can always be in a different mood. But yeah, like a lot of why I seek out things like that is because it's like the I mean, it makes me feel better about myself to work with kids, and it's, I don't know, it has this level of being rewarding that isn't there with some other work. So I would call it a form of self-care. It's kind of like, I guess, why some people will volunteer or whatever, you know. It's working with the kids has a different vibe. And I love that.
My favorite thing when I've worked with kids has been like they're just so self-involved that it like totally takes you out of yourself. Like they're just not interested in you or what you're doing. It's like all about them.
Yeah.
And I felt like it's just such a mental break because you're fully focused on them.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, what's this world that you're living in? And yeah, it's very fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, working with kids is a lot of fun. I really love it. And I haven't done as much work with them lately. I would love to do more with them again. But they've been working on a play recently that they just had. So it was called Profile. So, but yeah, I love working with kids.
How do you think kind of your politics or your attitudes about some of these things, do they reflect in the jobs or the freelancing work you pick up? Like, are there like organizations you won't work with, or organizations, like how does that end up playing out?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, throughout my career, I've kind of taken whatever gigs I can get because audio is really competitive. But I have tended to gravitate more towards, and maybe this has to do with like my gender and my political leanings and stuff like that, but I have tended to gravitate more towards trying to find gigs that are like, you know, the stuff with kids that are promoting peace and stuff like that. Working, you know, even just working on this podcast, you know, it's like.
Yeah, I mean, last season you worked with us like for free as a volunteer when your time is very valuable and demanding. And one, that was very appreciated, but like, you know, we didn't know, we had a class together in college, but we didn't know each other super well. And it was like years after the fact. And I remember reaching out to you, not to ask you, but to be like, do you know of a student who would like be interested? And it was like a really generous thing for you to do. But I'm curious for your perspective as someone who's been like behind the scenes, but has listened to every episode, kind of what is like your thinking? Are there tidbits that you thought were like interesting or useful that you've picked up along the way? Like, I'm curious about your journey with this podcast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, actually, a lot of it I've thought about. So you had one guest who was talking about their chronic migraines, and they were saying that they do certain stretches regularly. And so now, I mean, just the past few months, I started going to the gym or doing a workout like on a yoga mat in my condo every day. And so sometimes it's just a 10-minute thing, but sometimes it's like I go down to the gym and I bike for 30 minutes type of thing. But so in my condo, there's a sauna. It's like a dry sauna. It's really nice. So I started doing stretches for my headaches while I'm in the sauna after biking. So that's the thing that I definitely picked up from this podcast, and it seems to help. I've gotten into that. You had one person on who was a vegan activist, and even before that episode, I've been like kind of crushing on veganism. Like, I'm not fully a vegan, but I've been working to make my kitchen vegan. So that kind of helped me keep going with that. And now lately I've been feeling like less and less like I want to eat non-vegan whenever I'm out. So it's like I cook a lot at home. You know, most days I'm not going out to eat. But when we do go out to eat, I was doing non-vegan stuff. And lately I've been picking it more and more. But yeah, there's that. Let's see, what else? I don't know. What else have we?
You had some interesting feedback around like the Self-Care Sundays homecoming episode we did, where we were talking about like culture and appropriation. And you mentioned that you're part Native. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was because I thought like your thoughts on that were super fascinating. And I'd just like love to talk to you more about that if you're down.
Yeah.
So just for listeners who maybe don't remember, it was Carla Gaskin's Nathan episode where we were talking about the idea of kind of cultural appropriation and how self-care has been like, you know, like for me, like every time I want to do yoga as an Indian person, I have to take a class from a white person. And I'm like, oh my God, stop trying to sell me my culture. It's frustrating. And I had made in, I think, the unedited audio, this offhanded comment about how white people have traded in their culture for whiteness.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was raised very like white bread. Like I look very white. I mean, you know that. Anyway, so, but what I found out is one night it was like I was being super lazy at home on like a Friday, you know, in my PJs, and I started researching my grandma. And so my grandma's Spanish Basque, and so we always knew that. But parts of her family have been here. She was born in New Mexico, and parts of her family have been here for a really long time, like really, really long time. And so I was doing some research on it, and I had, you know, the info of what town she was born in and where she grew up and stuff like that. And so I was, you know, going down Google Maps and looking at the town and this and that. And then I started looking at like Ancestry, or I don't remember the website, but I was looking at like the websites where you can look up like census data and ancestry records and stuff like that. And I couldn't find any record of her being born in that town. And so I looked at the whole state of New Mexico for babies born on that day. And then I narrowed it down to like just female babies born on that day. And there was only one baby that wasn't already named with a different name. And that baby was born on a reservation. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So, I got like some DNA testing done and found out that I am a native. And I think what probably happened is that she was like white enough for them to, you know, like quote unquote pass her off as white. And it was during a time where like when she was younger and old enough to be giving birth and stuff, they were sterilizing Native women. So I think a lot of that was a survival thing. And so I think one of the things we talked about was the whole like white people giving up their identity for the sake of being white. And I think it just gets lost really easily. Like as soon as it gets given up, a lot of times it's by force, you know, like with that kind of situation, it could be by force or threatened force, right? And once it's given up, it's kind of forgotten. And the other part of that's like parts of my grandma's family, they have menorahs in their house, and they're all Catholic, right? It's like Spanish Catholic all the way. And but some of them have menorahs, and if you ask them about it, it's like, oh, that's a family heirloom. And it's like, oh, well, was the family Jewish at some point? And they're like, oh, no, definitely not. I mean, some people are all on board with this, and they're like, oh yeah, we were totally Jewish. But yeah, so I found out that there's a word for it, and this is kind of recent for me to find out. So it's called being a crypto Jew, and so it's like that's from the part of the family that came from Spain during the Inquisition. And so what they would do is there would be like usually one female in each generation that would keep the information that you're really Jewish, that you're secretly Jewish, but then everyone else would live as Catholics. And I guess it's out of fear of being persecuted again. And then sometimes, you know, if something happens to that one person, the information's lost, and then you have this family heirloom left, and it's like, well, we don't know, you know? So I thought that was super interesting too, finding that out. And actually some people in my family on my mom's side had like Ashkenazi in their DNA results. So
it's interesting because you're saying that like, well, like for some folks, yeah, that might be true, that like you buy into kind of for privileges of whiteness, but then there's also just like survival that comes from whiteness. And it's not just about like escaping oppression. And it's also, frankly, kind of really easy in retrospect and from a distance to say like, oh, why would you want to escape oppression instead of fighting it, right? Like that's a very like, I don't know, flippant thing to say, or very like thoughtless thing to say. But as you're pointing out, there are also like real threats, and like the distance between those two things is not very large, that there's some spectrum of that.
Yeah, and it's like it's hard to know when a perceived threat will become a real threat. So I think a lot of people will play it safe. And it's like no one really wants to give up their culture, you know? I feel like no one really wants to give up their culture. But yeah, the appropriation issue is interesting because I'm like, well, what if I look really white, but I'm part Native? Like, can I still wear a Halloween costume that's Native oriented in a little way? Like, it's confusing. And I don't know, I think it's interesting too because it's like my husband's part black, but he's very pale skin, and so he had like the full, I don't remember if you remember what he looked like, but he had the full like afro hair, you know? And I used to joke about like, okay, so when he shaves his hair off and he looks a little bit whiter, like if you don't know that he's part black, is him doing or saying certain things going to be perceived as cultural appropriation? Like, where do we draw the line? We're all just in this like spectrum.
Yeah, and I think also like acknowledging where it came from so that it doesn't just become like as American as yoga. No,
right?
Like, you just like erased hundreds of thousands of years of history. You know, like Brooklyn yoga, and I'm like, how? Like that's not where yoga comes from. Like it's very frustrating.
Right.
Like, but I'm glad that we had this conversation because I thought your point was a really valid one, and I wanted to have like a longer conversation about it rather than just like editing something out. So I wanted to ask you kind of our closing question, and since it's, you know, the last episode of the season, no pressure, but
oh, no.
What's a self-care habit that you're currently working on developing?
Currently working on. I mean, I already mentioned the going to the gym. That's kind of new the past so many months. And the head stretches and stuff. I've been working on my diet. So I had really bad eczema on and off for years. And so part of changing my diet's the whole vegan thing at home. But then part of it's also I got this blood test done and I have this like 10 different foods. It's like all the fun stuff. Like I can't have gluten or wheat. I can't have like eggplants or turkey. There's this whole list of things that I'm sensitive to. Dairy's on it, which isn't that big a deal for at home because of the vegan thing. But so I've been working on cutting those foods down and just like not getting eczema lately. So I've been doing that. I had something else that I was going to say. Oh, I've been working on, I don't know if this counts as self-care, but it's kind of like associated with like nesting and feeling better about yourself, I guess, is I've been working on doing...
Definitely part of self-care.
Right?
Feeling better for self-love is the basis of self-care, for sure.
So I feel like it applies. I've been doing, really getting focused on doing low waste and no waste packaging. And so like part of that is I have the luxury of being in San Diego where there's like farmers markets and all sorts of stuff and lots of places where you can buy things in bulk. But I've been doing more of the, like, if I go to the grocery store, I won't buy any produce that's in a plastic bag. I'll bring my little reusable cloth ones, and I'll only get the stuff that's not already packaged. You know, it just has like a twisty tie around it or whatever. And then I go to the farmer's market every week and I'll get stuff. And I found a place that sells stuff in bulk. So that's where I'll go to get rice and beans and stuff. So I've been working on doing that and kind of slowly switching over to things that don't waste plastic and packaging and all that environmental stuff. So
yeah, the food and exercise thing are like two big habits I'm also working on. So
yeah,
hopefully if and when we come back for season 3, we will both be in excellent shape.
There we go. Yeah, as long as we keep it up. I started a little over a year ago with the exercise, and then I stopped immediately because my last rabbit died, and I was just like done for a whole year. I didn't go back to working out, and I finally started back up again in the past few months. So yeah, hopefully we keep it up.
Yes, for sure. And on that, like, positive note about keeping it up and staying with self-care habits, I want to thank our listeners for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. This has been a phenomenal season. I don't think I've really said it on the show, but I feel like of kind of all the cool, fun stuff I've been privileged to have the opportunity to do, this is like my favorite thing that I've done because I feel like it's just so needed in the world, even if it really feels just so important and personal to me. So I'm really glad that I've had the chance to do it. And I want to thank all of our listeners for making it possible, and especially our patrons on Patreon who have made this entire season possible and are a huge reason why you're hearing the episode today. Especially our super contributors, Vicky B, Renu J, Brady K, Bill S, and Embershot. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter and Instagram at Self-Care Sundays and on Facebook at Self-Care Sundays Podcast. Cato, what are some social media handles where our listeners can follow you?
Okay, so I'm Cato Noise on pretty much everything. So I have my website, catonoise.com, and then pretty much everywhere I'm Cato Noise. So it's CATONOISE. And I have a YouTube too.
Awesome. And you do like great videos on audio production and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's all audio nerd stuff. Yeah.
Well, if you're a woman who's like, I've never thought about doing audio engineering, you should definitely listen and like check it out because, you know, then you can grow your ranks.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank the person who made our show art, Leah Horowitz, and the amazing artists who make our show music, For Real City, on behalf of our producer, Jess Falwar, our communications interns, Kennedy Freeman and Sophie Gomez, and our audio engineer, Cato Zane, who you've all met today, and myself. Thank you for listening.